Good evening, my friend. Turn the lights down low if you haven't already. Let the room go soft and blue. Pull the blanket a little closer, settle your head into the pillow, and let your shoulders drop the 2 inches they've been holding on to all day. You don't need to do anything else tonight. Just be here, in the dark, and let a story carry you somewhere far away. Before we begin, I have a question for you, and I mean it honestly. Where are you watching from tonight? What city? What country? What small corner of the world are you lying in right now? And what time is it for you? Is it the deep hush of midnight, or the strange stretched hour just before dawn? I think about this every time I sit down to write one of these. Somewhere out there, in 100 different time zones, people are closing their eyes to the same voice, the same slow unwinding of a story. If you'd like, leave a comment and tell me where you are and what time it is. I read them. It matters more than you'd think to know who's out there in the dark with me. Tonight I want to tell you about a world that looked on the surface like lace curtains and orderly streets and clocks ticking in polished parlors. A world of good manners and careful hats, and that underneath, quietly, was strange in ways that would astonish you. I want to tell you about Victorian England. Not the version with the crinolines and the foggy cobblestones that you've seen in 100 films. I want to tell you about the version where the wallpaper could poison a child, where a woman might carry a locket made from her dead husband's hair pressed against her collarbone, where teething babies were given medicine that contained the same drug used to numb the pain of the dying, and where all of it was simply Tuesday, simply normal. Nobody thought twice. This is the version of the story that is more honest than the one you already know, and I think, once you sit with it, you'll find it more remarkable too, because the strangeness of the Victorians was not the strangeness of costume dramas. It was the strangeness of ordinary people making do every single day inside a world that had not yet learned to protect them from itself. Let us go there together. It is somewhere in the early 1870s. The exact year doesn't matter so much as the season, and the season is autumn. The particular gray-gold autumn of London, when the light comes low and slanted through coal smoke, and the air smells of wet leaves and roasting chestnuts, and underneath all of it faintly of soot. It is 6:30 in the morning, somewhere in a narrow brick terrace house in a street you have never heard of and never will, one of 10,000 such streets, all of them nearly identical, all of them holding an entire universe behind each identical front door. A woman is waking up in the dark. Let's give her a name. Something plain, something you might have found on any christening register of the period, in any parish from Bethnal Green to Bristol. Let's call her Eliza. Eliza Whitfield, 31 years old, married 9 years to a man named Thomas, who works as a clerk for a firm that imports tea and dried goods from the docks. They have 3 children, Alice, who is 8 and already sharp-tongued and clever in a way that worries her mother slightly, Henry, who is 5 and has a chest that troubles him every winter, and the baby Rose, who is 11 months old and is at this very moment the reason Eliza is awake before the sun. I want you to picture Eliza's hands first, before anything else. Not her face, we'll come to that, but her hands, because hands tell you more truth about a life than a face ever does. Eliza's hands are reddened at the knuckles, slightly cracked at the first joint of each finger, the nails cut short and practical. There is a permanent faint yellow-brown stain along the side of her right index finger from lighting the kitchen range each morning with a sulfur match, and a rougher patch of skin on both palms from the wringer she turns twice a week to press the water from wet linen. Her hands are, in the most literal sense, the engine of this household. Everything that happens in this house happens because these hands make it happen, and almost none of what they do will ever be written down, counted, or paid for. Hold that thought. We will come back to it. Rose is crying, not the sharp, hungry cry, but the grinding, miserable cry of a child in pain, because Rose is cutting her back teeth, the molars which everyone agrees are the worst ones. Eliza lifts her from the small cot at the foot of the bed, and presses her against her shoulder, feeling the heat coming off the child's cheek. And she does what nearly every mother in England does at this exact moment, in this exact decade. Without a flicker of concern, she goes to the small chest of drawers, opens a paper packet, and rubs a pinch of teething powder onto Rose's gums with her finger. I want to pause here, because this is the part that almost nobody talks about when they picture the Victorian nursery, and it deserves more than a passing mention. The teething powder in Eliza's chest of drawers, and in the chest of drawers of nearly every household in the country, rich and poor alike, very likely contains mercury, most commonly in the form of calomel mercurous chloride, a substance manufactured and sold specifically to soothe fretful infants. It was in the powders, it was in the syrups. A tired mother in 1872 did not think of it as dangerous. She thought of it as help. The packet promised quiet, and quiet is a currency more precious than gold to a woman who has been awake since 4 with a screaming child and still has bread to bake, a husband to feed, and a floor to scrub before the light fails. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to turn this into a story about villainy, wicked chemists poisoning innocent babies, and that is not quite honest either. The chemist who compounded that powder was, in his own mind, providing relief. He had learned his trade from a master who had learned it the same way, using formulas that stretched back decades, formulas nobody had yet systematically tested against outcomes, because the entire apparatus of testing medicine against outcomes, controlled trials, the recording of side effects, the idea that a drug should prove itself safe before it reached a nursery shelf, simply did not exist yet in any organized form. There was no agency to stop him. There was, in large part, no concept that there needed to be one. The poisoning of English infants by their own medicine cabinets was not a conspiracy. It was a gap, an enormous, quiet, unpoliced gap between what chemistry could do and what anyone yet understood chemistry was doing. And into that gap fell thousands of children slowly over decades, their gums going soft and gray, their kidneys and nervous systems absorbing a slow poison delivered in the exact gesture of maternal tenderness. Rose, in this particular telling, will be fine. Most children were, in the sense that they survived, though fine is doing quiet work in that sentence, because nobody was tracking the smaller cognitive costs, the developmental costs of a childhood dosed regularly with mercury. Eliza will use the powder again tonight and tomorrow, because it is what everyone does, because the alternative is a screaming child and a mother who cannot function, and because nobody, not her own mother, not the chemist on the corner, not the doctor who occasionally visits when the family can afford him, has told her not to. This is the first thing I want you to sit with tonight. An entire generation of English children tended by women who love them fiercely and competently dosed daily with substances we would consider criminal today. And not one part of that story involves malice. It involves absence. The absence of knowledge is its own kind of violence, and it falls hardest, always, on the people with the least power to demand better information, which in 1872 meant, overwhelmingly, women and children. Let us stay with Eliza a moment longer, because her morning has barely begun. She settles Rose, who quiets slowly, thumb finding her mouth, and Eliza carries her down the narrow staircase to the kitchen, where the real labor of the day is waiting. The kitchen at 6:30 is cold. Properly cold, the kind of cold that makes your breath visible, because the range has not yet been lit. And lighting it is itself a 15-minute operation involving raking out yesterday's ash, laying kindling in a particular order that Eliza learned from her own mother and could perform blind, striking the sulfur match against the rough strip on the box and coaxing the coal into a steady burn while black smoke curls up toward a chimney that will need sweeping again before winter's end. I find myself thinking, when I picture this moment, about how much invisible expertise is contained in a single competent fire. Eliza knows, without having to think about it, exactly how much kindling a cold range needs versus a range that was banked overnight. She knows the particular smell of coal that has too much slate in it and will smoke rather than burn clean. She knows how long to leave the damper open before the room fills with fumes instead of warmth. None of this knowledge appears on any document. No one has certified her in it. If you had asked Eliza at this moment whether she possessed a skill, she would very likely have laughed at you. And yet, if you had taken her fire-lighting knowledge away from her, set her down in a kitchen with a range and no instruction, she would have failed at the first task of the day. The task on which every other task of the day depended, because nothing else in the household functions until the fire is lit. The kettle does not boil, the bread does not bake, the flat iron does not heat. The entire machinery of the Whitfield household begins with Eliza's hands, and a box of sulfur matches every single morning for the whole of her adult life. And this labor appears nowhere in any account of what her husband earns or what the household is worth. We will come back to the economics of this house because I promise you the numbers are worth sitting with. But first, breakfast. Because breakfast too holds a secret that I think will surprise you. Thomas will come down at 7, dress for the office, and he will eat bread and butter, perhaps an egg if the week has gone well, and drink tea. It sounds like the simplest meal in the world. It is not. The bread that Eliza did not bake herself, and in a household of this modest, respectable clerk's wife sort, she often did not have time to bake every loaf. So she bought some from the baker 2 streets over. That bread, in a startling number of English households in this period, contained alum. Alum was added to flour to make cheap, poor quality, or slightly spoiled flour appear whiter and more appealing, whiter bread being associated with refinement and quality in a way that darker, coarser bread was not. Alum in small doses interferes with digestion and the body's ability to absorb nutrients, and it was added quietly by bakers competing in a market where customers judge bread first by its color, and only much later, if at all, by anything else. The tea Thomas drinks might well have been stretched, bulked out with used tea leaves that had already been brewed once dried and re-dyed with substances that could include, in some documented cases, compounds containing lead or copper to restore the leaves' green or black color and disguise the fact that they had already given up their flavor to a previous pot. This was common enough and alarming enough that by the middle of the century it had become a subject of public concern and eventually of investigation. Chemists and journalists testing shop-bought food and publishing what they found. Sugar cut with sandpaper, cut with dust and floor sweepings, sweets colored with substances that included in some cases compounds of arsenic and lead to achieve a particularly vivid, appealing shade. I want you to sit with that last one for a moment, because it will come back later in tonight's story, in a much more intimate way. Bright green candies, the kind a child might be given as a treat, the kind that would sit in a glass jar on a shop counter catching the light, were sometimes colored using Scheele's green or a related copper arsenite compound, the same brilliant covetable green that was at that very moment being used to dye wallpaper, dress fabric, artificial flowers, and toys throughout the country. Arsenic in Victorian England was not hiding in a locked cabinet with a skull on the label. It was in the parlor. It was on the walls. It was, on occasion, in the suite a child unwrapped after Sunday service. This is not a story I am telling you to alarm you before sleep, quite the opposite. I am telling you because I want you to understand something about how ordinary danger becomes invisible when it arrives gradually enough and dressed attractively enough and is sold by people who are themselves not villains but simply working inside a system that had not yet learned to ask the right questions. Eliza does not think about any of this as she butters Thomas's bread. She thinks about whether Henry's cough sounds better than yesterday, whether she has enough coal to last the week, and whether she can afford this month the slightly better quality of tea from the shop on the corner instead of the cheaper blend that leaves a metallic aftertaste she has never quite been able to place. Let's talk about that wallpaper, because I promised you, and because it is, I think, one of the strangest and most quietly devastating stories of the entire Victorian century, and it touches this house directly. The parlor of the Whitfield home, the good room, the room where Eliza receives callers, where the good furniture lives, where a small vase of whatever flowers are in season sits on the mantel, is papered in a pattern Eliza chose herself 3 years ago with real pride, saving for months to afford it. It is a pattern of trailing leaves and small blossoms in a rich saturated green, the kind of green that seemed at the time to announce that this was a household of taste, a household that had moved beyond the muddy browns and drab creams of an earlier, poorer generation. Green wallpaper was by the 1860s and 1870s one of the most fashionable and desirable choices a family could make for their front room, and the most vivid, most admired greens on the market were achieved using arsenic-based pigments. Scheele's green, patented by the Swedish chemist Carl Wilhelm Scheele nearly a century earlier, and its close cousin Paris green, both of them copper arsenite compounds, capable of producing a color so bright and so stable that no other dye of the period could match it. The danger of this wallpaper was not fully understood, though it was not entirely unknown either, and this, I think, is the part that is genuinely difficult to sit with. They were doctors, chemists, and public health writers throughout the middle of the century who suspected correctly that our cynical wallpaper was making people ill. Headaches, nausea, skin irritation. A mysterious wasting sickness that seemed to afflict entire families living in brightly papered rooms, improving mysteriously whenever those families left home for a holiday, and worsening again on their return. The mechanism, as it would later be confirmed, involved a mold that could grow in the damp, poorly ventilated conditions common in English homes. A mold capable of metabolizing the arsenic compounds in the wallpaper paste and releasing them into the air as an invisible, faintly garlic-scented toxic gas. A family did not need to lick the walls to be poisoned by them. They needed only to live in the room, breathe the air, and let the damp English climate do the rest. And yet, the wallpaper stayed on the walls of a great many English homes for decades after these suspicions were raised, because the manufacturers who produced it were economically powerful, because the color was extraordinarily popular and difficult to replace with anything as vivid, and because, and this is the piece I want you to really sit with, proving harm in a court of public opinion. In an era before rigorous toxicology, before regulatory agencies, before any established mechanism for pulling a dangerous product from the market was extraordinarily difficult. Individual families who fell ill in brightly papered rooms had no simple way to prove that the wallpaper, rather than bad air or nerves or any of the dozen other explanations fashionable at the time, was the cause of their suffering. The burden of proof sat entirely with the sick, not with the seller and the sick, often women and children spending the most hours indoors. In the very rooms considered fashionable enough to paper in the most expensive green had the least power of anyone in the transaction to demand an answer. Eliza's parlor is not making her family gravely ill. I want to be honest with you rather than dramatic, because most are cynical wallpaper, in most homes, in most conditions, did not kill anyone outright. It produced something quieter and harder to trace, persistent headaches that everyone attributed to nerves or weather, a faint garlicky smell on humid days that nobody thought to question, a slight rash on Rose's arms in summer that the family doctor, when consulted, attributed to heat and recommended treating with a cooling lotion rather than a change of scenery. This is what I mean when I say the Victorians lived inside danger, that it learned to dress itself as ordinary life. It did not announce itself. It sat quietly on the wall, beautiful and fashionable, and slowly, patiently unwell-making, and an entire domestic science of small ailments and nervous complaints grew up around it, a whole vocabulary of vague suffering, the vapor's delicate nerves, a weak constitution. That, in an unknown number of cases, was simply the body's honest report of slow chemical poisoning filed under a heading nobody thought to open. I don't say this to frighten you. I say it because I think it's important to sit with how much of what a society calls normal is simply danger that hasn't yet been named, and how much courage and persistence it took from doctors, from a handful of stubborn chemists, from journalists willing to publish uncomfortable findings, and eventually from the women themselves comparing notes across garden fences about the headaches that only came in the good front room, to slowly, over decades, drag that danger into the light and give it a name. Change did not come from above, in a single decisive stroke. It came the way most real change comes, slowly, from the accumulated, stubborn observations of ordinary people who noticed that something did not add up, and who kept insisting on it long after they were told to stop worrying. Let us follow Eliza a little further into her morning, because I want you to see her dress, and I want to talk honestly about the garment underneath that dress, because it is one of the most misunderstood objects of the entire century. Eliza's corset hangs on a hook behind the bedroom door, and putting it on is a practiced, unhurried ritual, not the violent, breath-stealing cinching you may have seen dramatized, but something closer to what we might today call structural support, the way a well-fitted bra or a good pair of orthotic shoes provide support rather than punishment. I want to be careful here, because both extremes of the popular story are wrong. It is not true that corsets were comfortable, weightless things that modern imagination has cruelly exaggerated into instruments of torture. It is also not true that every woman in England was lacing herself into unconsciousness for the sake of a 17-inch waist. The truth, as usual, sits in the more complicated middle. A woman of Eliza's class and daily life. A woman who cooks, carries children, climbs stairs, kneels to scrub floors, and stands for hours at a washtub, wore a corset boned with whalebone or steel. laced to a size that gave her back support through a long day of physical labor, not the exaggerated hourglass silhouette reserved for portraits and evening wear. Tight lacing to extreme waist-crushing degrees was a real practice, but it was concentrated mostly among a narrower slice of fashionable leisured women who did not need to move freely through a working day, and even among them, the popular image of women routinely fainting from crushed ribs is, historians now generally agree, considerably overstated, a story that grew partly from genuine medical concern at the time and partly from later generations projecting their own discomfort with women's fashion backward onto a garment that was for most women who wore it. Simply underwear, unremarkable, put on every morning without a second thought. What I find myself thinking about when I picture Eliza lacing her stays in the gray morning light is not the garment itself, but the skill embedded in it. The fact that she can lace herself unassisted, reaching behind her back with practiced hands, tightening the crisscrossed cord to precisely the tension that will hold her comfortably through a 12-hour day. A skill she has performed perhaps 3,000 times in her adult life and has never once had anyone acknowledge as a skill at all. This is a pattern you will notice again and again tonight. My friend, if you let yourself notice it, the skill that becomes invisible the moment it becomes routine, and the peculiar Victorian talent for extracting an enormous quantity of expert practice labor from women, while insisting in the very same breath that what those women did all day required no particular ability at all. It just happened. The house was just kept. The children were just minded. Nothing about any of it in the language of the period was work in the sense that Thomas's clerking was work. Work that earned a wage, work that appeared on a balance sheet, work that a man could point to and say, "This is what I contribute." Eliza's labor supported the entire structure and appeared nowhere in its accounting. I want to stay with this a moment longer and give you the actual numbers, because I think the economics of a household like this one are more interesting and more revealing than most people ever stop to consider. Thomas earns in this telling roughly £90 a year as a clerk. A genuinely respectable income for the period, enough to mark the Whitfields as solidly comfortably lower middle class. The sort of family that could afford a small terrace house, one servant girl, who comes in for the heaviest work 3 days a week. And as we've seen, a nicely papered parlor. £90 a year works out to something under £2 a week, and against that £2 Eliza manages every single expense the household will incur. Rent, coal, food, clothing for 5 people, the servant girl's modest wages, medicine, when it's needed, the occasional small luxury like a length of ribbon or a bag of oranges at Christmas. She does this with no bank account of her own, because married women in England, at this point in the century, have only very recently, and only partially, gained the legal right to control property and money separate from their husbands. The full picture would not be settled until the Married Women's Property Act of 1882, still a decade away from where we're sitting tonight. Eliza's management of the household budget is, legally speaking, an act of delegated trust rather than an independent right. Thomas could, in principle, take the housekeeping money back into his own hands at any moment and be entirely within his legal authority to do so. He does not do this, and I want to be honest with you about why. Because it matters. He does not do this because Eliza is extraordinarily good at her job, because £90 stretched by a skilled household manager goes measurably further than £90 stretched by a careless one, and Thomas, whatever else he may or may not understand about his wife's daily labor, understands this much. The household runs smoothly, the children are fed and decently clothed, the rent is never late, and there is most months a small amount set aside for emergencies, all because Eliza has developed, through 9 years of daily practice, trial error, and the accumulated wisdom passed down from her own mother, a genuine expertise in what we might now call domestic financial management. She knows which cuts of meat stretch furthest in a stew and which are false economy. She knows exactly how many candles a week the household actually needs versus how many the servant girl will use if not watched. She knows when to buy coal in bulk at a slightly better price, and when the family's cash position that month makes buying in bulk impossible even though it would save money in the long run. The specific, grinding calculation of the person too poor to afford the cheaper option, a calculation that anyone who has ever lived paycheck to paycheck will recognize instantly, whatever century they live in. This is skilled, professional-grade labor. If you hired an outside accountant and household manager to perform Eliza's actual functions, budgeting, procurement, staff supervision, meal planning, textile maintenance, childcare coordination, and basic medical triage for a family of 5, you would be hiring several distinct professional roles and paying for all of them. Eliza performs all of it competently for decades and receives for it no wage, no pension, no professional title, and in the event that Thomas were to die, no independent claim to any property beyond what he specifically willed to her, minus whatever legal protections existed for widows, which were real but limited. I do not say this to make Eliza a symbol of oppression. She would resist that flattening as much as anyone, because she is not a symbol, she is a woman who takes real private pride in doing this work well, who feels something close to satisfaction when the month's accounts come out, even who is built within the narrow room she has been given something that is genuinely recognizably her own competence. Both of these things are true at once. She has built a form of mastery that is real and satisfying to her, and she has built it inside a structure that would never, under any circumstance available to her in 1872, recognize that mastery as work in the way her husband's clerking is recognized as work. This is not bitterness I am describing. It is something more patient and more complicated than bitterness, and I think it deserves to be looked at honestly, rather than either sentimentalized or turned into simple outrage. Let's step outside the house for a moment, because Eliza has calling card errands to run this afternoon, and the ritual of calling, of paying and receiving social visits, is one of the strangest, most elaborately coded systems the Victorians ever built, and almost nobody talks about how much quiet surveillance was embedded inside what looked from the outside like simple politeness. Here is how it worked, in broad terms, in a household of Eliza's class and aspiration. A woman did not simply drop in on a neighbor or acquaintance whenever she liked. There was a system, unwritten in law but enforced with a rigor that would have impressed any lawyer, governing who could call on whom, in what order, at what time of day, for how long, and with what consequence, if the rules were broken. A new family moving into the neighborhood did not call first on the established families. The established families, if they judged the newcomers acceptable, called first on them, an act that functioned as a kind of social ratification, a stamp of approval that could be granted, or more devastatingly, withheld. A woman whose card was not returned within the correct interval understood, without a single word being exchanged, that she had been quietly, permanently excluded. And there was no appeal, no explanation offered, simply a silence that everyone in the neighborhood could read as clearly as a printed notice. The card itself was a small rectangle of stiff paper, engraved rather than printed if you wished to be taken seriously, bearing a name and sometimes an address, and the manner in which it was presented carried its own vocabulary. A corner turned down in a particular way signaled that the card had been delivered in person rather than by a servant. Different corners, turned down in different combinations, could signal condolence, congratulation, or a call made specifically to say goodbye before a departure. A woman receiving callers kept and consulted a precise mental ledger, sometimes a literal written one, of who had called when, how promptly she had returned the visit, and what that pattern of calls and returns revealed about where she stood in the local hierarchy of respectability. I want you to notice what this really was underneath its lace-edged surface. It was a surveillance system built and maintained almost entirely by women upon women, with no police force and no courtroom, and no need for either, because the true enforcement mechanism was simply the threat of being noticed and found wanting. A woman who spent too freely, dressed too far above her station, or entertained the wrong sort of acquaintance, did not receive a formal reprimand. She received, instead, a slow contraction of her social world. Cards not returned, invitations quietly stopped, a coldness at church that never announced its own cause. This is the part that almost nobody talks about when they picture Victorian gentility, how much of what looks from a distance like elaborate courtesy was, up close, a finely calibrated instrument of control, operating entirely through withheld warmth. And yet, I want to hold the other side of this too, because both things are true. The calling system also gave women something genuinely valuable that is easy to overlook if you only see its punitive side. A legitimate, respectable reason to leave the house to move through the neighborhood, to build and maintain a network of relationships entirely of their own making, in a world that offered women very few other avenues for independent social power. The friendships forged over calling hour tea were often real friendships, the information exchanged often genuinely useful, which doctor could be trusted, which shop was overcharging, which servant girl had left her last position under a cloud and should be avoided. I do not think you can understand the calling system honestly unless you hold both of these facts at once. It was a cage, and it was also within its bars. One of the only rooms in the house that belonged entirely to the women who lived there. Let us walk a little further down the street with Eliza, because there is a house 3 doors down the Pargeter house with black crepe still hanging in the front window, and I want to tell you about mourning, because I think it is the single strangest, most demanding, most quietly devastating social institution the Victorians ever constructed, and it touched every woman in England sooner or later, usually more than once in a lifetime. Mrs. Zerole, Pargeter's husband, died in the spring. A fever, nothing dramatic, the kind of ordinary death that visited nearly every household of the period at least once since childhood illness infection. And complications of childbirth carried away a portion of every generation with a regularity that we from this distance can barely imagine. And from the moment he died, Mrs. Myton, Pargeter's life became governed by an elaborate, precisely calibrated schedule of grief that had almost nothing to do with what she actually felt and everything to do with what the world required her to display. For a widow of her class, full mourning lasted, by the convention of the period, a full year and a day, sometimes stretched to 2 full years for a woman determined to demonstrate exceptional devotion. For the first year she wore black, and not just any black. A dull, matte black entirely without shine, made from fabrics like bombazine and crepe, specifically chosen because they absorbed light rather than reflecting it. Because even a subtle gleam of satin was considered an unacceptable note of vanity in a grieving woman. Her jewelry, if she wore any at all in this first phase, was restricted to jet, a black fossilized wood that could be carved and polished but never made to sparkle. Or, and this is the detail I most want you to sit with tonight, jewelry made from her husband's own hair. Hairwork jewelry was an entire craft industry in Victorian England, with specialist workers publish pattern books and dedicated shops that would take a lock of a deceased loved one's hair and weave braid or set it into brooches, rings, watch chains, and elaborate framed wreaths meant to hang on a parlor wall. A skilled hair worker could braid strands of hair into intricate basket weave patterns, finer than you would think humanly possible, using techniques in which strands were woven over a cylindrical mold, using dozens of small bobbins, a process requiring weeks of patient, exacting labor. Mrs. Pargeter, 3 doors down, wears a small oval brooch at her throat containing a woven lock of her husband's hair beneath a dome of glass, and she will wear it more or less daily, for years, not as a morbid curiosity, which is how it might strike you at first, but as the period's own version of what we might today think of as a memorial locket, a way of keeping the physical, tangible presence of someone she loved literally against her skin. I want to be careful here because I think it would be easy to look at hair jewelry and see only strangeness and miss the tenderness inside it. Consider what the alternative was. There was no photography readily available to most families before the middle of the century, and even once it became more accessible, a photograph was a flat, distant thing, a likeness, but not a physical piece of the person. Hair does not decay the way flesh does. It survives, more or less unchanged, for decades, for centuries. A lock of hair woven into a brooch was, to Victorian sensibility, not a morbid trinket, but something closer to the last physically enduring piece of a person you had lost. The economics of mourning, though, I promised you I would keep returning to the money, and here the money tells a story of its own kind of quiet cruelty. A widow of Mrs. Clyte, Pargeter's modest means faced, in the weeks immediately following her husband's death, an entirely new wardrobe requirement, purchased at exactly the moment her household income had, in all likelihood, just been reduced or eliminated. An entire industry of mourning warehouses existed specifically to serve this demand. Vast emporiums that stocked nothing but black clothing, black-bordered stationery, black-trimmed household linens, and every accessory a family in grief might be expected to acquire, at prices that assumed not unreasonably that a grieving family had little bargaining power and less patience to shop around. A widow who could not afford an entirely new mourning wardrobe faced a second, quieter humiliation on top of her grief, The visible, legible poverty of wearing an inadequately black dress dyed rather than woven black to her own husband's funeral, an economy that her neighbors would notice and silently judge. And here's the detail I find myself thinking about most. When I sit with this story, the rules of mourning were far stricter, far longer, and far more exhaustively codified for women than for men. A widower was expected to observe a much shorter period of black clothing, often only a matter of months, and faced almost none of the elaborate staged half-mourning transition, the slow, carefully monitored return to color and pattern that a widow was required to move through in precise stages. A man could remarry within the year with relatively little social comment. A woman who set aside her mourning clothes even slightly early, or who was seen laughing too freely, risked being permanently marked as heartless. Grief itself in Victorian England was gendered, timed, costumed, and policed. And the person left holding the greatest cost of displaying it correctly was, overwhelmingly, always the widow, never the widower. I want to leave Mrs. Pargeter's house for a moment and take you somewhere else in the neighborhood, because I think it's time to talk about light and about how strange and new and slightly miraculous it must have felt in this particular decade, to watch a room fill with a kind of brightness that had not existed for most of human history. By the early 1870s, gaslighting had reached most middle-class London streets, and a good many middle-class parlors, though it had not yet reached everywhere, and the Whitfield house still relies, in the room's gas has not reached, on oil lamps and candles the way every English household had for centuries before. But 2 streets over, in a slightly grander terrace, gas has been piped in, and in the evening, that house glows with a steady, even faintly hissing brightness that makes candlelight look, by comparison, like something from another century entirely. Gaslight did not flicker the way a candle did. It did not need to be relit every few hours. It could, for the first time in history, make a room as usable at 10 at night as at 10 in the morning. And this single fact was beginning quietly to reshape English domestic life in ways nobody yet fully understood. Consider what this meant for reading, for instance. A woman like Eliza, who in her mother's generation would have had perhaps an hour of genuinely comfortable evening light before eye strain and the expense of candles made further reading impractical, could in a gaslit house read for as long as she liked, provided the gas bill could bear it. And gas, unlike candles, was billed by consumption in a way that made the household's lighting cost newly visible, newly calculable. A fresh category in Eliza's careful monthly accounting. And gas brought its own quiet dangers too. Dangers that sat alongside its brightness the way the arsenic sat inside the beautiful green wallpaper. Gas leaks were common enough to be a genuine ongoing household anxiety. A faint smell in a room, a headache that would not lift the very real possibility of a slow, invisible poisoning from an ill-fitting pipe joint that had begun imperceptibly to fail. Houses fitted with gas required, for the first time, a new kind of vigilance from the women who ran them, the learned skill of noticing a smell before it became dangerous. Here again is that pattern I keep returning to tonight, a new expertise, quietly required, quietly gendered, quietly unacknowledged, layered on top of all the older expertise that had never gone away. Let me tell you about something else that was arriving in these years, more slowly, more unevenly, but arriving nonetheless. Ice. Not the ice that formed naturally on a cold morning, but ice as a purchasable commodity, harvested from lakes and ponds in colder climates, packed in sawdust and shipped in bulk, to be sold block by block, to households that could afford an icebox, a wooden cabinet lined with tin or zinc in which a large block of ice, replenished every few days, could keep perishable food noticeably cooler than the ambient temperature of a Victorian kitchen. The Whitfields do not yet own an icebox. It remains at this point in the decade a small luxury reserved for households with somewhat more disposable income than a clerk's £90 a year comfortably allows. But Eliza has seen one in the home of Thomas's employer, and she understands exactly what it would mean for her daily life. Less frequent shopping trips in summer, less daily anxiety about milk turning before the children could finish it. I find this detail worth sitting with because it captures something true about how technology actually arrives in ordinary lives, not as a single dramatic transformation, but as an uneven, patchy spread, visible in a neighbor's kitchen before it appears in your own. Eliza is not poor. She is not struggling in any dramatic storybook sense, but she is managing every single day a set of small technological absences, and managing them well is itself a form of expertise, a constant low-grade calculation of what can be preserved, what must be used quickly. What small risk of spoilage is acceptable this week given the household's current finances? There is one more house I want to take you past this morning before we come back at last to Eliza's own kitchen. A house at the end of the street where on Thursday evenings, a small group of women gather around a table with the curtains drawn, and I want to tell you about them, because spiritualism in this decade was not a fringe curiosity. It was, for a significant portion of English society, a serious and respectable pursuit, practiced by educated, thoughtful people, and I think it deserves to be understood on its own terms rather than dismissed simply as superstition. The women who gather at the Ashworth house on Thursday evenings are not credulous fools. They include a doctor's wife, a school teacher, and a widow whose son now lives abroad and writes home rarely. They sit at a round table, hands lightly touching, and they wait for a rap, a tilt, a message spelled out letter by letter as the table tips toward one side of the alphabet or another. And what I want you to understand is that this practice arose directly out of a Victorian world saturated with loss in a way that is difficult for us, from this distance, to fully feel. Infant and child mortality remained painfully high throughout this period. Death in childbirth remained a real and present danger for every woman who became pregnant. Illness that we would now treat easily. Infections, fevers, the ordinary hazards of a world without antibiotics, carried away husbands, wives, children, and siblings with a regularity that meant almost no adult in England reached middle age without having buried someone they loved deeply. Spiritualism offered something that the formal religious and medical institutions of the period, for all their authority, could not: a direct, immediate, ongoing conversation with the specific person who was gone. I do not think it is an accident that seance sitting was, overwhelmingly, a practice led and populated by women. The formal channels of grief and religious authority in Victorian England were controlled almost entirely by men. The seance table, by contrast, required no ordination, no medical degree, no institutional credential of any kind. A woman with a sensitive temperament, a quiet room, and a willingness to sit patiently in the dark could become within her own small circle an authority, holding a kind of power that no other institution in her world was prepared to grant her. I want to be honest with you about the fraud too, because there was a great deal of it. Professional mediums touring the country and charging admission developed elaborate technical tricks. Hidden wires, collapsible trumpets, secret compartments, Confederates planted in the audience, and a good number of them were exposed, publicly and often humiliatingly, by skeptical investigators. But I think it would be a mistake to let the fraud of the professional circuit erase the sincerity of what was happening in ordinary front rooms like the Ashworths, where no admission was charged, and where the women gathered were engaged, as far as anyone can tell across this distance of time, in something they experienced as entirely genuine. Both things are true. The seance table was, in some hands, a stage for calculated deception, and the seance table was in many more hands a genuine, improvised, deeply human response to a level of loss that the Victorian world simply generated more of, more often than our own world does, without ever building the emotional infrastructure to help ordinary people carry it. Let me tell you now about something that touches Eliza's own household more directly than any seance. Something sitting at this very moment on a shelf in her kitchen in a small dark bottle with a chemist's label. Laudanum, a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, sat in an enormous number of English medicine cabinets in this period, available without prescription from any chemist shop, sold openly and cheaply. Used for everything from a crying infant to a grown man's toothache to a woman's monthly pain, to the simple, exhausted desire of an overworked mother to get 4 consecutive hours of sleep. Eliza keeps a small bottle behind the flour tin, purchased for 2 pence from the chemist on the corner, and she has used it exactly as her own mother used it before her, a few drops in warm water for Henry's cough that will not let him sleep, a slightly larger dose once deeply reluctantly, when Rose was a newborn, suffering from what the chemist called colic. I want to be careful here because it would be very easy to turn this into a story of Victorian recklessness, and that framing misses the reality of what Eliza was actually choosing between. There was no health visitor to call. There was no telephone to summon a doctor in the middle of the night. And even had there been, a doctor's visit cost money the household could not always spare. Laudanum was cheap, effective, immediately available, and, critically, it worked. The tragedy embedded in laudanum's ordinariness was not that mothers were careless. It was that laudanum was by a wide margin the single most effective piece of medical technology available to an ordinary working household, and its very effectiveness masked for decades the slow accumulation of dependency it could produce, and the very real risk of accidental overdose in an infant whose tiny body could not process even a modest dose the way an adult's could. There is a version of this story marketed specifically to women, and I think it is worth describing on its own, because it reveals something particular about how Victorian medicine understood or failed to understand women's pain. A great many patent medicines of this era, sold under names that promise soothing, restorative, gently feminine relief, were formulated with substantial quantities of alcohol, opium, or somewhat later in the century cocaine, and marketed directly at women suffering from the vague catch-all diagnosis of nervous complaint or hysteria. A diagnostic category so broad that it could be applied to almost any woman whose distress did not fit neatly into a category. Male physicians were prepared to investigate further. I want to pause on this, because I think it's one of the more quietly devastating patterns of the entire century. An enormous number of women's genuine physical and psychological suffering was treated throughout this period not by asking what was actually wrong, but by administering a substance that made the asking unnecessary. This is not a story about wicked doctors. Most of them believed sincerely that they were helping. It is a story about an entire medical culture that had built, without quite realizing it, an extraordinarily effective machine for making women's pain quiet without ever making it understood. Let me tell you about one more strange tender custom before we return to Eliza's kitchen, because I think it belongs alongside the hair jewelry we spoke of earlier. Another way the Victorians found to hold on to the dead in physical, tangible form, and one that tends to shock modern listeners more than almost anything else in this story. Post-mortem photography, the practice of photographing the recently deceased, often dressed in their best clothes, sometimes posed as though merely sleeping, was a widespread, unremarkable practice throughout the middle decades of the century, particularly for children, whose deaths were common enough that a family might have no other photograph of a child at all. Photography itself was still new enough, still expensive enough, that for a great many working families the death of a child was, heartbreakingly, the single occasion significant enough to finally justify the cost of a photographer's visit. I want you to sit with the tenderness inside this practice rather than only its strangeness. A post-mortem photograph was very often the only image that would ever exist of a beloved face. The alternative to a post-mortem photograph was not a living photograph. Instead, it was no photograph at all, nothing but memory which fades, against a technology that offered something memory alone could not, a fixed, permanent trace of a face that would otherwise simply vanish from the world entirely. There is a smaller, gentler cousin to this practice worth mentioning too, the Victorian fascination with taxidermy, with pressed flowers under glass, with cases of preserved butterflies and mounted birds arranged as though still in mid-flight. This impulse to stop a living or once living thing at its most beautiful moment and hold it there, permanently, safe from decay, runs through so much of what we've talked about tonight. The Victorians lived in a world of genuinely constant, unpredictable loss. And against all of that loss, they built an entire aesthetic devoted to arresting decay wherever they possibly could. Let us come back now to Eliza, because the morning is moving on without us, and there is a whole day still ahead of her. By mid-morning, she has lit the fire, fed the children, dosed Rose's aching gums, dressed for the day, and she has begun the day's actual work. The wash that must be started early, because it takes hours. The bread that must be checked. The accounts that must be balanced before Thomas comes home wanting to know whether the week's expenses have stayed within what they agreed. I want you to picture her for a moment standing at the kitchen table with a small notebook open in front of her, a stub of pencil in her reddened hand, adding a column of figures that represents an entire week of decisions nobody else in the household will ever fully appreciate. the halfpenny saved by buying slightly bruised apples instead of perfect ones, the decision to patch Henry's shirt rather than buy new fabric this month. She adds the column twice to be sure, and the total comes out 1 shilling and 4 pence under what she expected a small victory she will mention to no one, because there is no one in her world positioned to understand it as a victory at all. This is where I want to pause with you for a moment. Not at an ending, because Eliza's day does not end at mid-morning, but at a breath. The particular quiet that settles into a house once the fire is finally drawing well, and the bread is finally in the oven, and there is for just a few minutes nothing left to do but wait. Eliza sits down at the kitchen table, Rose finally quiet and drowsy in her lap, and looks out the small window at the gray London morning. Before we go further, my friend, let me ask you to do one small thing. If this kind of evening is useful to you, reach over, tap the like button, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. I don't say this to interrupt the story. I say it because these videos take a great deal of research and care to put together properly, and your small gesture of support is genuinely what allows me to keep making them, night after night, for people exactly like you lying in the dark wanting somewhere true and gentle to rest your mind. Thank you. Now back to Eliza and to Monday, because Monday in this house is not like other days. Monday is wash day, and I want to tell you about wash day properly, because if there is one single day of the Victorian domestic week that reveals more completely than any other the sheer physical scale of the labor we've been discussing all morning, it is this one. Eliza has been dreading it faintly since Sunday evening, the way you might dread a long day of hard, necessary work that cannot be postponed. It begins before dawn, earlier even than her usual rising, because the copper, the large vessel built into the corner of the scullery used for boiling water and linens, must be filled and lit well in advance. The fire beneath it fed steadily for hours to bring a full tank of water to the rolling boil that Eliza's whole process depends on. While the copper heats, she sorts the week's laundry into the categories her mother taught her and her mother's mother taught before that. Whites first, because they can bear the boiling water, and harsh soap that colored fabrics cannot. Colored things next, washed more gently. And finally the heaviest, dirtiest items requiring a first rough scrub before they even join the general wash. The soap itself she has likely made a portion of at home or bought in a hard plain bar from the chemist. Harsh, alkaline, hard-on skin that had no protective lotion to follow it. The kind of soap that leaves Eliza's hands by the end of a wash day cracked and stinging in a way she has simply learned to live with. She scrubs each item against a ridged washboard, wringing, re-soaping, scrubbing again for stains that a modern detergent would lift in a single cycle, and that here require the full strength of her arms and shoulders, repeated item after item, for hours. Once washed, the linens go through the mangle, a heavy device of 2 rollers cranked by hand through which wet fabric is fed to press out the worst of the water before hanging. A task that requires real upper body strength and leaves Eliza's forearms genuinely more muscled than a woman of her class was generally expected to display, though, of course, no one ever remarked on this, because strong forearms on a wash day were simply assumed invisible, the same way her fire-lighting expertise was invisible. A basket of wet linens once wrung weighs a genuinely startling amount, enough that carrying 2 full baskets out to the small yard where the lines are strung back and forth again and again over the course of a morning constitutes a physical labor that a modern gym would charge admission for and call a serious workout. If the day is fine, the washing dries in the yard, catching London's coal smoke air in a way that means even freshly laundered linens carry a faint sooty note no amount of scrubbing quite erases. If the day is wet, the washing must be hung indoors, strung across the kitchen, on lines that turn the one warm room in the house into a maze of dripping fabric, filling the air with the particular damp, slightly mineral smell of wet cotton drying slowly near a fire. By early afternoon, if all has gone well, the servant girl arrives. A 15-year-old named Sarah, who comes 3 days a week from a family 2 streets over, paid a few pence and her midday meal for helping with the heaviest work. I want to tell you a little about Sarah, because her position in this household reveals its own layer of the story, a layer sitting just beneath Eliza's, a hierarchy of women's labor within women's labor that the period rarely examined honestly. Sarah earns in this arrangement perhaps a shilling or two a week, plus her food on the days she works, money she brings home entire to her own mother. Because a girl of 15 in a family that needs her wages does not generally keep so much as a farthing of it for herself. She has been in domestic service since she was 12, and she will very likely remain in service until she marries, at which point she will leave paid domestic service behind entirely and begin an unpaid version of precisely the same labor in a household of her own. Eliza is, by any fair measure, kind to Sarah. But I want to be honest about the structure underneath even this kindness, because it matters. Eliza is Sarah's employer in every meaningful sense, holding real power over the girl's hours or workload, and the reference that will determine whether Sarah can find a better position in future. The invisibility of domestic labor that we've spent this whole morning examining was not evenly distributed even among women themselves. It fell heaviest always on whoever stood at the bottom of whatever local hierarchy happened to exist, and in this house on this Monday, that person is Sarah, turning the mangle with arms not yet as strong as Eliza's. Earning in a full day's hard labor less than the cost of the ribbon, Eliza will, if the month goes well, allow herself as a small Christmas indulgence. There is one more small oddity I want to leave you with before we pause, because it belongs to this same morning, and because I think it captures in miniature everything we've been circling around tonight. When Henry's cough worsened briefly last winter, the family doctor, summoned at real expense, a full consultation costing more than Sarah earns in a week, examined the boy, listened to his chest, and recommended, among other things, a small application of leeches to draw what he called the excess of blood contributing to the inflammation. This was not an eccentric suggestion for the period. Leeches remained a genuinely mainstream medical tool throughout much of the century, sold by chemists in specially designed jars applied by trained practitioners for a wide range of complaints, understood within a medical framework that had not yet fully caught up with what was actually happening inside a sick child's body. Eliza held Henry's hand through the procedure, told him it would help, and believed, entirely sincerely, that it would. I tell you this not to mock the doctor, who was within the limits of what his profession then understood, doing his genuine best for a sick child, but to underline something I think matters more than any single strange fact tonight. Almost none of what we've walked through this morning, the mercury in the teething powder, the arsenic in the wallpaper, the leeches on a coughing boy's chest, the corset, the calling cards, the morning rules, the hair jewelry, the laudanum behind the flour tin, was the result of anyone behaving badly. It was the result of an entire civilization operating at the very edge of what it understood, doing its careful, earnest best with tools that were not yet good enough for the people they were meant to serve. The Victorians were not foolish. They were, in a sense that I find genuinely moving, to sit with exactly as intelligent, as loving, as careful as we are now working, with less information than we have inside structures that made it very difficult for anyone, even the most observant among them, to see the whole shape of the danger they were living inside. The morning is nearly gone now. Henry has been sent off to the small school 2 streets over. Alice trails behind him with her satchel and her sharp, watchful eyes, and Eliza, with Rose finally asleep in the small crib by the kitchen fire, allows herself, for just a moment, to sit entirely still, hands quiet in her lap, for the first time since 6:30, the copper cooling in the scullery, the bread cooling on its rack, the whole house settling into the particular hush of early afternoon. There is still a full day ahead of her. There are still calls to pay, a dinner to plan, an evening to manage, and a night, eventually, that will bring its own small rituals before this long Victorian day is finally fully done. We will go there together, my friend, into the afternoon, into the evening, all the way to the moment the last lamp in this small London house is finally turned down and the street outside goes quiet. But for now, let this be our resting point. Stay easy. Stay warm. We left Eliza sitting still for a moment at her kitchen table, Rose drowsing in her lap, the London morning turning slowly toward afternoon. Let us stay with her, my friend. There is more of this day to walk through together, and I promise you the strangest parts are still ahead. The stillness does not last long. It never does, in a house like this one. By 12:30, Rose is down for her nap in the small crib by the fire, and Eliza has an hour, perhaps a little more, before she needs to think about dinner, and an hour, in Eliza's calculation, is not a rest. It is an opportunity. She takes down her bonnet, checks the small purse of coins kept in a tin on the mantel, and sets out for the shops because Thursday is a shopping day. And there is a particular errand today that I want to walk through with you because it touches something we have not yet spoken about. The language of flowers. You may have heard of this before in passing as one of those quaint Victorian curiosities, the idea that flowers carried secret meanings, that a bouquet could be read like a letter. I want to tell you that this was not a quaint curiosity at all. It was for a woman like Eliza one of the only channels of communication available to her that operated entirely outside the supervision of husbands, fathers, and the general watchful eye of respectable society. And I think that fact alone makes it worth taking seriously rather than treating as a charming footnote. Here is how it worked. An entire published vocabulary existed, dictionaries of floral meaning sold in small decorative volumes that sat on many parlor tables, including in this telling a well-thumbed copy on Eliza's own shelf, assigning specific meanings to specific flowers, and further meanings to the way those flowers were arranged, presented, and even held. A yellow rose might signal jealousy or infidelity depending on which dictionary you consulted, because the vocabulary was never fully standardized, which was itself part of the point. It left room for a kind of plausible deniability that a more explicit form of communication could never offer. A gift of striped carnations could decline an unwanted proposal without a single word needing to be spoken aloud, sparing both parties the raw exposure of a direct refusal. A spray of rosemary sent to a mourning household spoke of remembrance in a way that required no visit, no awkward conversation, simply a small bundle left at the door. I find myself thinking about this whenever I picture Eliza pausing at the flower seller's stall on the corner, considering which blooms to send to a neighbor whose engagement has just been quietly, scandalously broken off. A message of sympathy that could not, under the rules of the calling system we discussed this morning, be delivered any more directly without risking exactly the kind of visible, judged social gesture that the neighborhood's surveillance apparatus would immediately notice and discuss. The language of flowers let women speak to one another in a code the men around them rarely bothered to learn precisely because it was considered a feminine decorative interest, beneath serious attention, which is exactly what made it useful. Here again is that pattern from this morning, an entire sophisticated system of communication, built and maintained by women, hiding in plain sight inside something the wider world dismissed as mere prettiness. There is a companion to this worth mentioning briefly that lived not in the garden but in the hand, the language of the fan, a set of gestures, equally elaborate, equally unofficial, by which a woman at a ball or an evening gathering could signal availability, disinterest, a warning, or an invitation entirely through the angle at which she held a folded or open fan, the hand that carried it, the speed with which she moved it before her face. A fan held to the left ear meant one thing, drawn across the cheek another, twirled in the left hand something else again. I want to be honest with you that historians disagree about exactly how widely and precisely this code was actually used in practice, versus how much of it was invented or exaggerated by fan manufacturers eager to sell a novelty alongside their product. But even allowing for exaggeration, the underlying truth holds. Women in this period built, out of the smallest available materials, entire private grammars of meaning because the official channels of expression open to them were so narrow, so supervised, so thoroughly governed by rules made by other people. That invention became not a luxury, but a necessity. Let me walk you now toward a different shop on Eliza's route because I want to tell you about a trade that touches this street more directly than flowers ever could, and about a phrase you have almost certainly heard before without knowing quite where it came from. 2 doors past the flower seller is the hatter's shop, run by a man named Griggs, and Griggs, like every hatter of his generation, works with mercury every single day of his professional life. Felt hat making throughout the 19th century involved a process called carding, in which animal fur, rabbit, or hair, most commonly, was treated with a solution of mercuric nitrate to roughen the fibers and make them mat together more easily into felt. This process was standard across the entire trade, taught by masters to apprentices exactly the way any other trade secret was taught, and it filled small, poorly ventilated hatting workshops with mercury vapor day after day, year after year, for the working lifetime of every man in the trade. The effects were not subtle, and they were not secret. Not by this point in the century. Hatters as a professional group were known widely and specifically for a cluster of symptoms: trembling hands, slurred speech, irritability, memory trouble, a characteristic unsteady walk. Severe enough and common enough that the phrase "mad as a hatter" had already by the middle of the century become common English idiom used casually, the way we might use any expression whose literal origin has been half forgotten, even as the phrase itself survives. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because it is one of the clearest examples in this entire story of a danger that was not hidden at all. It was named, joked about, woven into the very language people use to describe eccentric behavior, and still nothing changed for decades because the men affected were tradesmen, not gentlemen. Because there is no institutional mechanism to connect a widely known joke to a regulatory response, and because the hatters themselves, dependent on their trade for their livelihood, had little practical choice but to keep working with the substance that was slowly and visibly taking their hands and their minds. Griggs at this point in his career has a fine tremor in his right hand that he has learned to work around bracing his wrist against the counter when he needs particular steadiness, and a habit of losing his train of thought mid-sentence that his regular customers have simply learned to wait out patiently the way you wait out any familiar quirk in someone you've known for years. Nobody in the neighborhood thinks of Griggs as a poison man. They think of him as Griggs, a bit odd, a bit forgetful, good at his trade despite it. The way you might think of any tradesman whose particular occupational wear has simply become part of his personality in the eyes of everyone who knows him. This is, I think, one of the most quietly devastating truths in the whole of this story. Sometimes the danger was not invisible at all. Sometimes everyone could see it, could name it, could joke about it in the street. And it changed nothing. Because seeing a danger and having the social and economic power to do something about it are two entirely different things, and the people who most clearly saw the cost of mercury in hat making were overwhelmingly the very men who had the least power to demand the trade be done differently. Eliza buys this afternoon not a hat but a length of ribbon to retrim Alice's bonnet, which has grown shabby with a summer's wear, and as Griggs wraps the small parcel with hands that shake only slightly, she asks after his wife and he asks after Henry's chest, and the whole exchange takes on the ordinary, unremarkable texture of any small transaction between neighbors who have known each other for years, neither of them dwelling, even for a moment, on the invisible chemistry sitting quietly behind the counter doing its slow work. I want to walk you now toward one more fashion story before we turn back toward Eliza's kitchen and the dinner that needs making, because I think it belongs alongside the wallpaper we spoke of this morning, and because it will surprise you in a slightly different way. Do you remember the vivid green we talked about earlier? Scheele's green, the arsenic-based pigment used in wallpaper and sweets and toys. That same brilliant coveted color was also throughout the middle decades of the century one of the most fashionable shades for a woman's evening gown. And dye works across England and the continent produced yards upon yards of arsenic green silk and tarlatan for the dressmaking trade, sold to women who wanted more than almost anything to be dressed in the most admired color of the season. The people who suffered most acutely from this fashion were not, in fact, the women who wore the finished gowns, though there were documented cases of dermatitis rashes and general ill health among women who wore arsenical green regularly, particularly those who danced in it, working up a heat that released the pigment more readily against warm, perspiring skin. The people who suffered most were the workers who made the dresses, the seamstresses and artificial flower makers, overwhelmingly young women and girls who spent entire working days with green dye dust settling into their lungs, into open cuts on chapped hands, into every crease and fold of skin that came into contact with treated fabric hour after hour, for wages that were, even by the standards of a period not known for generous wages to women, notoriously low. There were in the same decade published accounts, investigative journalism of the sort that had already begun exposing food adulteration, documenting cases of artificial flower makers falling seriously, sometimes fatally ill from prolonged arsenic exposure, their hands developing sores that would not heal their vomit, reportedly tinged green from the dust they had breathed and touched all day. I want to be honest with you about why I'm telling you this, because it is not simply another entry on tonight's list of strange dangers. It is, I think, the clearest illustration in this whole story of how danger in Victorian England distributed itself according to power, rather than according to exposure alone. The women who wore the arsenic green gowns to balls and dinners suffered real but generally survivable discomfort, a rash, an itch, an ailment blamed on nerves. The women who made those gowns, standing at the bottom of an entirely different economic hierarchy, absorbed the same poison in far greater, far more concentrated doses. For money that would not have purchased so much as a single yard of the fabric they spent their days handling, and their suffering registered in the newspapers and in the public conversation of the time, as a matter of concern, precisely because journalists and reformers made the deliberate choice to go looking for it to interview the workers themselves, rather than simply the fashionable women who wore the finished product. This is the honest complication I want to leave with you before we move on. The same fashionable danger touched every rung of the social ladder and touched each rung by a completely different measure, heaviest always at the bottom, exactly where the least power existed to refuse it. Let us turn back now toward Eliza's kitchen, because dinner will not cook itself, and I want to walk you through the particular choreography of a Victorian evening meal, because I think you will find as we go that even something as ordinary as cooking dinner required a kind of expertise that has almost entirely vanished from ordinary life today. By 3:30, Eliza is back from her errands, Alice collected from school on the way home, Rose awake again and propped in a low chair at the corner of the kitchen where she can watch without being underfoot, and the real work of dinner begins. There is no gas range in this kitchen. That remains like the icebox, a feature of grander households than the Whitfields, and so dinner is cooked entirely on the coal range Eliza lit before dawn and has kept tended in one form or another ever since, banking the fire during the quieter hours of the day and building it back up now to the steady, even heat that roasting and boiling require. I want you to understand what it meant in this period to cook without a thermostat, without a dial, without any mechanism at all for setting and holding a precise temperature. Eliza judges the heat of her oven by holding her bare hand inside it and counting, a skill passed down exactly the way her fire-lighting knowledge was learned, entirely through repetition and correction, entirely undocumented, entirely invisible to anyone who did not watch her do it. She judges when meat is properly roasted not by any timer but by the particular way the juices run when she pierces it, by smell, by the sound the fat makes as it spits in the pan. This is not guesswork, whatever it might look like to modern eyes. It is a genuinely sophisticated sensory calibration, built from thousands of repetitions, that produces reliably edible food from an oven with no controls at all beyond the amount of coal fed into the firebox and the position of a few adjustable dampers. Dinner tonight is a modest joint of mutton stretched with vegetables to serve 5 people and likely to reappear in one form or another for at least 2 more meals before the week is out. Because waste in a household managing on Thomas's £90 a year is simply not a possibility Eliza can afford to entertain. Nothing goes to waste in this kitchen. Bones become stock. Vegetable trimmings become the base of tomorrow's soup. Stale bread becomes a pudding, sweetened with whatever fruit or sugar the week's budget allows. This entire economy of use and reuse, invisible to Thomas, who simply eats what is placed before him and assumes in the unexamined way that people assume things about labor they have never had to perform themselves. That food simply appears because that is what food does in a well-run household represents another entire dimension of Eliza's daily expertise, a kind of culinary triage performed fresh every single day, with no reference book beyond the accumulated knowledge in her own memory. While the mutton roasts, Eliza turns to the mending basket because there is no such thing in this house as idle time between tasks. The concept simply does not exist for a woman in her position. She sits at the kitchen table with Henry's stockings darning a heel worn through by a boy who runs everywhere he goes. And I want to pause on this small, quiet image for a moment, because I think it captures something true about the rhythm of her entire day, even her rest, if you could call this rest, is productive. Even the 10 minutes she allows herself to sit while the mutton finishes cooking is filled with useful work, because a woman in Eliza's position has internalized so completely that it no longer registers as a choice. The understanding that her hours belong to the household's needs before they belong to her, and that idleness, even brief, even earned, carries a faint whiff of moral failure that she has never once, in 9 years of marriage, allowed herself to fully indulge. Let us stay with the children for a moment because the evening, once dinner is cleared, brings its own set of rituals that I think will surprise you. Small, ordinary domestic customs that, examined closely, turn out to be genuinely strange by any modern standard. Bathing in a household like the Whitfields is not a daily occurrence. This will likely surprise you more than almost anything else I've told you tonight, because we live now in a world where daily bathing is so thoroughly assumed that its absence seems, at first, almost impossible to imagine. But hauling and heating enough water for a proper bath, filling a tin tub set up in front of the kitchen fire, since there is no fixed bathroom with running hot water in a house of this modest size, is a substantial undertaking requiring multiple trips to the pump, multiple kettles heated on the range, and a significant investment of exactly the kind of physical labor Eliza has already spent all day performing. A full bath in this household happens perhaps once a week, generally on a Saturday evening in preparation for church, with the children bathed first in the same water one after another. Each child's turn slightly grayer and cooler than the last, and Eliza and Thomas, if they bathe at all that week, making do with the same water after the children are done, or more commonly, washing separately with a basin and cloth on the intervening days, what the period sometimes called a sponge bath, a thorough wash of face, hands, underarms, and other essential areas without the full undertaking of an entire submerged bath. I want to be careful here not to let this sound like Victorian uncleanliness in the way that phrase might land on modern ears, because that framing misses something important. Eliza is, by the standards of her own time and her own community, a scrupulously clean woman, attentive to her family's hygiene in every way the practical constraints of her life allow. She washes hands and faces multiple times a day. She keeps the children's hair carefully combed and checked for lice with a fine-toothed comb, a weekly ritual as routine and unremarked as any other. What has changed between her century and ours is not the value placed on cleanliness, but the technology available to achieve it. Running water heaters, indoor plumbing, none of which exist yet in a house of this size and income, and all of which will, within a few more decades, transform bathing from a weekly labor-intensive project into a 5-minute daily convenience that later generations will take entirely for granted, never once pausing to consider what it replaced. There is a smaller ritual, though, that happens every single night in this household, regardless of whether it is a bathing night. And I want to tell you about it, because it involves a substance you would never think to associate with dental care. Before bed, Eliza has the children clean their teeth using a mixture that in many households of this period consisted of finely ground charcoal or soot, sometimes combined with a pinch of salt, rubbed onto the teeth with a cloth or a stiff brush, the household not owning and likely never having encountered anything resembling modern toothpaste, which does not yet exist in any commercially recognizable form. Powdered chalk was another common ingredient, along with in some published recipes of the period. Small amounts of borax, or even in wealthier households seeking a particularly white result, a pinch of a more aggressively abrasive substance that a modern dentist would immediately flag as damaging to enamel with regular use. Alice's teeth at 8 years old are already showing the fine wear pattern that comes from years of abrasive cleaning combined with a diet heavier in bread sugar and starches than in the fresh produce that might have balanced it. And this, too, nobody in the household thinks to question, because it is simply how teeth are cleaned, the way it has always been done, the way everyone's teeth have always been cleaned, as far as anyone in this house can remember. Let me tell you about bedtime itself now, because I think the small physical details of a Victorian child's night will stay with you longer than almost anything else in tonight's story. The house is cold at night, properly thoroughly cold, because coal costs money and Eliza cannot justify keeping fires burning in the bedrooms once the family has retired, and so the warmth of the day dissipates steadily through the evening hours, until by the time the children are tucked into bed, their small bedroom holds only the residual heat of the day and whatever warmth their own bodies and blankets can generate together. Against this, Eliza has one small tool that I find myself thinking about often when I picture this house at night. The warming pan, or in a household of more modest means like this one, more commonly a stone-hot water bottle, or even a flat iron heated on the kitchen range, and wrapped carefully in flannel slid between the sheets an hour before the children go up, so that when Henry and Alice climb into bed, the worst of the chill has already been driven out of the linens by a patient, deliberate act of preparation that Eliza performs every single night without exception, rain or shine, illness or health, because a cold bed on a cold night is for a small child a genuine and immediate misery that a mother in her position has both the means and the responsibility to prevent. Henry and Alice share a bed, as siblings of the same modest household very commonly did throughout this period. Separate bedrooms for each child being a luxury reserved for households considerably wealthier than the Whitfields. And I want you to picture them there, in the dark, two small bodies pressed together for warmth as much as for company, whispering the way children do after the candle has been taken away. Alice telling Henry some elaborate, half-invented story about the day's events at school, until sleep takes one and then the other, and the house room by room, floor by floor, begins its long settle into night. I want to pause here and tell you something about candles, because it is a small detail, but I think it matters. A single candle in this household is a genuine expense to be managed with the same careful attention Eliza brings to every other item in her monthly accounts. And so the children are not permitted a light left burning through the night, no small comfort against the dark beyond whatever moonlight might find its way through the thin curtains, no gentle glow to ease a 5-year-old's fear of shadows in the corner of an unfamiliar-feeling room grown suddenly larger and stranger once the candle is gone. This is not cruelty. It is arithmetic, the same unforgiving arithmetic that governs every other choice in this house. And Henry, like every child of his generation, has simply learned the way children learn anything repeated often enough, that the dark is not something to be lit away, but something to be endured and eventually slept through. Let me tell you about something now that belongs to Eliza herself rather than to the children, because I think it reveals a different, more private corner of this world, the corner where a woman's own vanity, her own quiet wish to be considered handsome, collided with exactly the same unregulated commercial landscape that gave us the arsenic wallpaper and the mercury teething powder. On the small shelf above her washstand, tucked behind a plainer bottle of rosewater, Eliza keeps a small paper packet of complexion wafers purchased somewhat guiltily from a chemist 2 neighborhoods over rather than the one on her own corner. Because even in 1872 there was a faint unspoken awareness that a fashionable woman's interest in her own complexion was a thing best pursued a little privately, a little apart from the everyday respectable transactions of daily shopping. These wafers, small tablets meant to be swallowed rather than applied, promised a pale, luminous, fashionably delicate complexion, the kind of skin considered most beautiful throughout much of the century, precisely because it signaled that its owner did not labor outdoors, did not need to earn her keep beneath an unforgiving sun, pallor itself functioning in this period as a visible marker of class, of leisure, of a life spent indoors rather than working a field or a market stall. And a great many of these wafers, sold openly, marketed directly to women exactly like Eliza, contained arsenic. I want you to sit with the particular cruelty of this fact for a moment, because it circles back, in a way I find genuinely striking, to everything we discussed this morning. The same substance quietly poisoning families through their wallpaper was being sold in a different form directly to women who wanted more than almost anything to be considered beautiful. Women swallowing small measured doses of the very poison that might already be leaching invisibly from their own parlor walls. Arsenic taken internally in small enough doses does produce, at least temporarily, a pale, somewhat luminous quality to the skin, along with a certain brightness to the eyes, real, visible, cosmetically desirable effects that made the wafers genuinely popular among women determined to achieve a fashionable pallor through means faster and more reliable than simply staying indoors and hoping. What those women could not see, of course, was the slow, cumulative cost being paid beneath the visible surface, the same damage to organs and nervous system that the wallpaper caused, now delivered directly, deliberately, by choice, rather than by chance. There is a companion cosmetic practice, slightly older, but still very much in use in this period, that I want to mention alongside the wafers, because it involves a substance whose name you will likely recognize from an entirely different context. Belladonna deadly nightshade, whose extract was used by fashionable women to dilate the pupils, producing the large dark, luminous eyes considered a mark of particular beauty. The very word belladonna meaning in its original Italian, beautiful lady, a name given to the plant specifically because of this cosmetic use. A drop or two in each eye before an evening engagement produced the desired dramatic effect, along with, though this was less well understood at the time, blurred vision sensitivity to light, and with repeated or excessive use. The same real risk of systemic poisoning that ran through nearly every beauty practice of this century, because belladonna, whatever its cosmetic charms, is a genuinely toxic plant whose active compounds do not confine their effects politely to the eyes alone. I do not tell you this to suggest that Eliza or any woman of her period was foolish or vain in some way that deserves your judgment. I tell you this because I think it reveals something honest about how thoroughly the ordinary human desire to be found beautiful, a desire that belongs to every century including our own, and is not something to be dismissed or moralized about, could be quietly systematically exploited by a commercial landscape with no obligation to protect the people buying what it sold. Eliza wants, in a way she would find difficult to explain even to herself, to look well when she stands at the door to receive an unexpected caller, to feel for a moment that she is more than simply the engine of this household's daily survival. That wish is not foolish. It is entirely recognizably human. And the machinery around her, the same machinery that sold mercury for teething and arsenic for wallpaper, was entirely willing to meet that wish with a product that would slowly and invisibly cost her more than she could have imagined when she first slipped the small paper packet into her basket. Let us move now toward the evening, because Thomas will be home soon, and I want to walk you through the particular texture of an ordinary Victorian evening in a household like this one, quieter than the day, in some ways, but not, as you might expect, restful. Thomas arrives home a little after 6, tired, in the particular way of a man who has spent the day bent over ledgers in a poorly lit office, and the household reorganizes itself around his return the way it does every single evening, a small daily choreography, so familiar that nobody in the house consciously registers it as choreography at all. Eliza has dinner ready to serve within minutes of his arrival, the children washed and combed and presentable, the parlor tidied of whatever domestic clutter the day's labor has generated, because a well-run household by the standards of this period presents itself to the returning husband as though the day's chaos had never happened at all. The labor that produced this calm surface entirely invisible by design. The way a stage set is built to look effortless precisely because enormous effort has gone into making it appear that way. Dinner conversation such as it is belongs mostly to Thomas, an account of the day's business, a complaint about a difficult colleague, a piece of news read in the evening paper about matters far beyond this small street, delivered with the easy assumption entirely unexamined, because it has never once been challenged in 9 years of marriage, that his day is the one worth narrating in detail, while Eliza's day, however physically demanding, however full of small crises competently managed, is compressed into a few sentences at most. The children were well, the washing is done, Henry's cough seems better. I want to be careful here, because I do not think Thomas is unkind, or that this arrangement reflects any particular cruelty on his part specifically. He is behaving exactly as every man of his class and generation has been raised to behave, absorbing, without ever having to examine it, the deep cultural assumption that a man's labor, because it is paid, because it happens in a visible, external, institutionally recognized workplace, simply matters more as a subject of conversation than a woman's labor, however demanding, because it happens inside a house unpaid, unwitnessed by anyone with the social authority to declare it significant. After dinner, the evening settles into its familiar shape. Thomas retires to the small armchair by the parlor fire with the newspaper, and Eliza returns to the mending basket she set aside before dinner, or takes up a piece of plain sewing, a shirt to be made over, a hem to be taken up, because, as I mentioned earlier, there is genuinely no such thing as idle evening time in this household for the person responsible for keeping it running. If the gas is lit in this room, and by 1872 in a household of the Whitfields modest but respectable, means it very likely is at least in the parlor, gas having spread further into middling households than into working-class ones by this point in the decade. Eliza works by its steady, even light rather than the flickering, eye-straining glow of a single candle. And I want you to imagine, for a moment, what this must have felt like to a woman whose mother's generation would have put away needlework at dusk out of simple physical necessity, an extension of the useful evening hours that must have felt, at least at first, like something close to a small miracle, however quickly it settled into ordinary expectation, the way every new technology eventually does. There is a wireless kind of communication reaching this house too, though not the kind we mean by that word today. The telegraph by 1872 connects London to every major city in England, and increasingly to the wider world, carrying news and messages across distances that would have taken days by post in a matter of hours or even minutes. And though the Whitfields do not own a telegraph, no ordinary household did the technology being accessed through public telegraph offices rather than installed privately in homes. Thomas has on occasion sent an urgent message this way. In the very existence of the telegraph, the awareness that news from distant places could now arrive within the same day it happened rather than weeks later was beginning quietly to compress the felt size of the world for ordinary English people in a way that is genuinely difficult to overstate. A woman like Eliza reading in the evening paper about events happening in cities she will likely never visit, arriving within a day or two of their occurrence rather than the weeks such news would have taken to travel just a generation or two earlier, was living through one of the most significant compressions of time and distance in the whole of human history, though, of course, it did not feel that way to her. It felt the way all technological change eventually feels from the inside, simply like Thursday. I want to tell you about one more evening ritual before we move toward bedtime and eventually toward sleep, because it involves photography again, though, in a gentler form than the post-mortem portraits we discussed this morning, and because I think it will give you a clearer sense of how precious, how deliberate, how genuinely rare a photograph still was to a family like the Whitfields in 1872. There is a single photograph in this house. A small, stiff-mounted portrait taken 3 years ago on the occasion of Rose's older sister's christening. No, forgive me, on the occasion of a family gathering the year before Rose was born, when Alice was small enough to sit on Eliza's lap, and Henry stood solemn and uncomfortable in his good clothes beside his father's chair. The sitting cost more than Thomas earns, and nearly 2 weeks required the entire family to travel to a photographer's studio across town and demanded that everyone hold perfectly, rigidly still for several long seconds while the photographer's apparatus captured the image, a stillness that explains why so many Victorian photographic portraits show faces with an oddly fixed, unsmiling expression. Not because the Victorians were grim or joyless people as popular imagination sometimes assumes, but because holding a genuine smile without blinking or shifting for the full duration of a long exposure was in practice considerably harder than holding a neutral, composed expression, and a blurred smile ruined an expensive sitting far more thoroughly than a serious one ever could. This single photograph hangs now in a small frame in the parlor, and I want you to understand what an object of genuine, almost sacred value it represents in this household, not because the Whitfields are sentimental in some excessive way, but because it is quite simply the only visual record that will ever exist of exactly how this family looked at exactly this moment in their lives, and everyone in the house understands, without ever having to say so aloud, that a moment like this one, once past, is past absolutely, with no way to revisit it except through the single fixed image on the parlor wall, and whatever fragments memory chooses imperfectly to preserve. I find myself thinking whenever I picture that small frame catching the gaslight about how strange and precious a single photograph must have felt to a generation that had grown up with none at all, and how casually, how carelessly, we treat the thousands of images a single day of our own lives might now generate without a second thought. Let me tell you about Henry's chest again, because I promised you this morning that his cough would come back into the story, and it does tonight in a way I think you'll find genuinely surprising. Henry's cough has been troubling him again these past few evenings, the particular tight wheezing quality that Eliza has learned over 5 years of mothering him through winters to recognize as something more than an ordinary cold, what a modern doctor would very likely diagnose as asthma, though that word in 1872 is used rarely and imprecisely, and the treatment available to Eliza tonight involves a product that I think will astonish you. An asthma cigarette purchased from the same chemist who sells the teething powder and the laudanum containing dried and rolled stramonium, a plant related to belladonna and, like belladonna, containing genuinely potent and potentially dangerous alkaloids. The cigarette is lit, and Henry is encouraged to breathe in the smoke, which does in fact produce real bronchial relief. Stramonium having genuine, if crude and imprecisely dosed, properties as a bronchodilator. The very mechanism that makes modern asthma inhalers effective, delivered here through the deeply strange, entirely unregulated medium of a burning cigarette, handed to a 5-year-old child by his own careful, loving mother. I want you to sit with this image for a moment. because I think it captures more vividly than almost anything else in tonight's story the genuine strangeness of medicine in this period, not because anyone involved was foolish or careless, but because the entire framework for understanding which substances were appropriate for which ages, which doses were safe, which delivery methods made sense, simply had not yet been built. Stramonium cigarettes were sold quite openly, specifically for the relief of asthma and related breathing complaints, marketed to parents exactly like Eliza, who wanted nothing more than to ease their child's genuine physical distress, using the best tool the market had made available to them. Henry's wheezing does ease within a few minutes of the smoke, and Eliza tucks him into bed that night with something close to relief, having done by every standard available to her exactly what a good and attentive mother should do. There is a lighter, gentler oddity I want to mention before we turn fully toward bedtime, because it involves Alice rather than Henry, and because I think it will make you smile rather than wince, which feels, at this hour of the evening, like the right note to strike. Alice has this past week become fascinated with a small pamphlet borrowed from a school friend describing the practice of phrenology, the now entirely discredited but in 1872 still quite seriously regarded pseudoscience, holding that the shape and bumps of a person's skull revealed specific truths about their character, their intelligence, their moral tendencies, mapped out across a series of numbered regions, each said to correspond to some particular trait, from benevolence to acquisitiveness to a capacity for what the pamphlets called amativeness. Phrenology parlors, where a practitioner would examine the bumps on a paying customer's head and deliver a detailed character reading, existed in most sizable English towns throughout much of the century, patronized by people across the social spectrum who took the practice, if not always with total seriousness, then at least with genuine curiosity and a measure of real credence. Alice, at 8 years old, is taken to running her small fingers over her own head at bedtime, solemnly announcing to Henry which bumps she believes she has located, and what admirable qualities they must surely indicate, and Eliza, listening from the doorway, finds herself smiling in a way that has nothing to do with believing a word of it, and everything to do with the simple pleasure of watching her clever daughter turn even a piece of dubious science into a game, a small private mythology shared between siblings in the dark. I tell you this small, warmer story because I think it's important at this point in the evening to remember that not everything strange about this world was dangerous or sad. Some of it was simply odd, harmless, a little bit delightful. Grown adults paying good money to have strangers feel the bumps on their heads. Children playing at the same practice in the privacy of their own beds. An entire society working out with genuine sincerity and occasional real silliness how to understand a human mind it did not yet have the tools to properly study. I want to tell you now about the smaller, quieter world below stairs, because I mentioned Sarah earlier. And I think her world and the wider world of domestic service that a great many households like the Whitfields depended on deserves one more moment of attention before we let this particular Tuesday close. The Whitfields employ only Sarah part-time, but a household with slightly greater means than theirs, the family 2 streets over and the house with gas already installed. The house with the icebox Eliza has seen and quietly envied employs a full household staff, a cook, a housemaid, perhaps a nursemaid for the youngest children, each occupying a precisely defined rung in a hierarchy, every bit as codified, every bit as rigorously enforced as the calling card system we discussed this morning. A cook did not perform a housemaid's work, and a housemaid would have been deeply offended to be asked to perform work considered beneath her particular station within the servant hierarchy, the between maid. If a household was large enough to employ one occupying a genuinely uncomfortable position expected to assist both the senior housemaid and the kitchen staff belonging fully to neither group, often eating alone rather than with either established faction of the servants' hall. This hierarchy, invisible to most employers who rarely concern themselves with its internal politics, mattered enormously to the women living inside it, because a servant's position determined not only her wages and working conditions, but her entire social standing within a world that offered her almost no other avenue for status or advancement. A cook at the top of the domestic hierarchy in a household without a butler or housekeeper above her held real authority, hiring and dismissing kitchen maids, Managing a household's food budget with a degree of independent discretion, many mistresses were happy to delegate entirely, building within the narrow world of domestic service something that functioned in its own contained way, as a genuine career with its own genuine ladder to climb. This is worth remembering, I think, alongside everything else we've discussed tonight about invisible women's labor, even within the ranks of the most thoroughly unacknowledged workers in Victorian England hierarchies of skill authority. And status still mattered enormously to the people living inside them, because human beings will build meaning and structure out of whatever material is available to them, even when the wider world outside has decided that material does not deserve serious notice. Let us come back now fully to the Whitfield house, because the evening is drawing on. But before we let this day close, there is one more conversation I want you to overhear, because it happened in this telling only a few nights ago, and I think it belongs here near the end, because it touches the deepest layer of everything we've discussed tonight. Alice, at 8 years old, is sharp. I told you that at the very beginning of tonight's story, and I meant it. She reads faster than most children her age, asks the kind of questions that make her schoolteacher pause before answering, and has recently developed a fierce private fascination with arithmetic, working sums in the margins of her school slate long after the lesson has moved on to something else, simply because she enjoys the clean, satisfying certainty of a column of figures adding up correctly. A week ago, over dinner, Alice asked her father with the blunt directness only a child of 8 can manage, without seeming rude, why she could not go on to the kind of school Henry would eventually attend, the grammar school 2 miles distant, with its Latin masters and its serious curriculum, rather than the more modest establishment where girls of her age and class learn needlework, basic sums, and enough reading and writing to manage a household and correspond politely with acquaintances. Thomas did not answer unkindly. I want to be clear about that, because it would be easy to imagine this moment as a scene of open cruelty. And it was not that at all. He answered the way a genuinely fond father, operating entirely within the boundaries of what his world had taught him to consider natural and sensible, would answer, that a clever girl was a fine thing, that he was proud of her quick mind, and that a good education for a girl meant preparing her to be a good wife and a capable mother the way her own mother had been prepared before her, and that Latin and advanced arithmetic, however interesting they might seem to an 8-year-old at the dinner table, would not serve her half so well in the life that was actually waiting for her as the domestic skills she was already quite properly beginning to learn. I want to sit with this exchange for a moment, because I think it captures something essential about the deep structure underneath everything we've discussed tonight, more essential in its way than the arsenic or the mercury or any of the physical dangers we've walked through. Because this is not a danger that will show up in a doctor's examination. It is a danger to possibility itself, a quiet, well-intentioned, entirely unmalicious narrowing of what a clever, curious child is permitted to imagine for her own future, delivered not through cruelty but through the simple, unexamined assumption that this is simply how the world works, has always worked and will presumably go on working, an assumption so complete that it does not even feel from the inside like a constraint at all. It feels to Thomas like common sense. It feels increasingly to Alice like the shape of her own life beginning to settle around her, whether she has chosen that shape or not. Eliza, listening from the kitchen doorway during this exchange, said nothing at the time. It was not in the world she inhabits a mother's place to contradict a father's judgment on a matter of this kind, particularly not at the dinner table, particularly not in front of the children. But I want to tell you something Eliza did afterward, quietly, on her own, because I think it is one of the truest and most tender details in this entire story. Later that same week, without any announcement or explanation, she began setting aside from the household's grocery money a small sum each week, a penny here, tuppence there, money she could account for easily enough if Thomas ever asked, folded into the ordinary fluctuations of a household budget she alone manages and understands in its full detail, toward the cost of a slightly better arithmetic primer for Alice, the kind used in the boys' school rather than the simpler one issued to girls, purchased eventually from a second-hand bookstall and given to Alice not as a gift with any explanation attached, but simply left quietly on the corner of the kitchen table where her daughter would find it. I want to be careful here, because I do not want to overstate what this small act means. It is not a rebellion. It is not a grand statement of principle. Eliza would very likely be baffled, even faintly offended, if you suggested to her that she was doing anything so dramatic as defying her husband or challenging the settled order of her world. She would tell you, if you asked her directly, that she simply thought Alice ought to have a proper book, because Alice loved her sums, and a mother notices what her children love. But I think there is something quietly, powerfully significant in that small, unexplained gift all the same. A woman who has spent her entire adult life inside a structure that gives her almost no formal power at all, finding, in the one domain where she does hold real and complete authority, the household accounts, a small private space in which to make a choice on her daughter's behalf that the wider world around her had already decided was not really hers to make. This is not bitterness. It is something more patient and more complicated than bitterness, and I think it is, in its own small way, one of the most hopeful details in this whole long day, proof that even inside a structure built to narrow a girl's possibilities before she is old enough to fully understand what is being narrowed, a mother's quiet, unannounced attention can still sometimes hold a door open just slightly, on the chance that her daughter might one day find it and walk through. Alice does not yet know, and will not know for years, that the primer on the kitchen table came from anywhere other than simple good fortune. She simply works her sums by firelight most evenings now, a little further into the book each week, entirely unaware that she is the quiet beneficiary of her mother's careful, patient, entirely invisible act of hope. Let me tell you, too, before we finally let this day rest, about Sunday, because Sunday in this household carries its own small, distinct texture that I think deserves a moment before we close. Church in the morning, the whole family dressed in their best, Eliza's own Sunday bonnet retrimmed each season with whatever small updates the household budget allows, because appearing at church in visibly outdated fashion would be noticed quietly by exactly the same neighborhood eyes that track the calling cards and the morning schedules we discussed this morning. After church, a slightly better dinner than the week's ordinary fare, and an afternoon that is by the strict conventions of the period meant to be given over to rest and quiet, contemplative activity rather than active labor, needlework permitted but only of a devotional kind, reading permitted but preferably of an improving or religious character rather than a novel, which many households of Eliza's particular temperament and class still regarded, in this decade with a faint residual suspicion, as slightly frivolous, slightly dangerous to a properly ordered mind, even as novel reading was in practice becoming steadily more common and more accepted with each passing year. I mention Sunday not because anything especially strange happens on it, but because I think its very ordinariness, its careful rule-bound quality even in supposed rest, tells you something true about how completely this world was governed by unstated codes of proper behavior, codes so thoroughly absorbed that breaking them rarely required an explicit rule to be broken at all, simply a felt instinctive sense, shared by everyone in the neighborhood, of what a respectable family did and did not do, with a Sunday afternoon enforced by nothing more than the same quiet ambient watchfulness that enforced everything else we've discussed tonight. By 9 o'clock the children are long asleep. The mending is folded and put away, and Thomas has set down his newspaper stretched, and begun the small nightly ritual of banking the parlor fire so it will hold through until morning without wasting coal it does not need to waste. Eliza moves through the house on her own smaller circuit of closing rituals, checking that the kitchen range is properly damped, that the back door is bolted, that the small lamp left burning low in the children's room, if there is one tonight, has enough oil to last until she checks on them once more before her own bed. I want to slow down with you now, my friend, the way the night itself slows down in this house. There is no more list to walk through, no more strange fact waiting around the next corner. Just the quiet, ordinary choreography of a household settling itself for sleep, performed the same way it has been performed every night for 9 years, and will be performed again tomorrow and the night after that. For as long as this particular arrangement of walls holds this particular family inside it. Eliza climbs the narrow stairs last, candle in hand, because the gas does not reach the bedrooms of this house, and pauses, as she does most nights, at the door of the children's room. Henry's breathing has evened out, the stramonium smoke long since cleared from the air, his wheeze quieted for tonight, if not for good. Alice sleeps with one hand still resting, unconsciously, against the side of her own skull, as though even in sleep she is keeping watch over whatever admirable bumps she believes herself to have discovered there. Rose, in the small crib in the corner of Eliza and Thomas's own room, sleeps the deep, boneless sleep of a child whose teething pain has, for tonight at least, finally released its grip. Eliza stands in the doorway a moment longer than she needs to. I find myself thinking, whenever I picture this exact instant, about what passes through a woman's mind in a moment like this one, the last quiet minute of a day that began with a crying baby in the dark before dawn and has moved hour by hour, task by task, through fire lighting and bread baking and wallpaper and washing and mending and dinner and mercury and mourning and hair jewelry and a whole invisible architecture of skill that nobody around her has ever once thought to name as skill at all. I do not know exactly what Eliza is thinking, standing in that doorway. None of us can ever fully know what passes through the mind of a person we did not have the chance to ask directly, and I think it would be dishonest of me to pretend otherwise. But I find myself imagining something like this: a small, private, wordless satisfaction, not loud enough to call happiness exactly, but real nonetheless. The quiet, earned knowledge that the household held together today, that everyone was fed, that everyone is, for tonight, safe and warm and breathing evenly in the dark, that the accounts came out 1 shilling and 4 pence ahead, that tomorrow will ask the same of her again, and that she will in all likelihood meet it the same way she met today, competently and visibly without complaint, because complaint has never once been an option genuinely available to her, and because underneath everything else there is a real and quiet pride in doing a hard thing well, even when no one is watching closely enough to notice. She goes to her own bed at last. Thomas is already there, already drifting, and the candle is snuffed, and the room goes dark. The particular thick, complete dark of a house with no electric light anywhere within its walls. A darkness that modern life, with its glowing clocks and standby lights and street lamps leaking through curtains, has almost entirely forgotten how to produce. I want to tell you what I find myself thinking about whenever I sit with a story like this one, because I think it matters more than any single strange fact we've walked through tonight. I think about how much of what we have discussed, the mercury, the arsenic, the leeches, the laudanum, the corsets, the calling cards, the mourning rules, the hair jewelry, was never really about villainy at all. It was about the size of the gap between what people knew and what they needed to know, a gap that every single generation lives inside in its own particular way, usually without recognizing it until much later, when a future generation looks back with the easy clarity of hindsight and wonders how anyone could have missed something that now seems so obvious. I think our own century has its own version of that gap, filled with its own substances and practices and quiet dangers that we cannot yet see clearly because we are standing too close inside them. The same way Eliza stood too close to her own green wallpaper to smell the faint garlic note that would 150 years later finally be explained. This is not a comforting thought exactly, but I think it is an honest one, and I think honesty, offered gently, is worth more than false comfort. I think too about the sheer scale of the labor we've walked through today. Eliza's hands reddened and cracked, lighting a fire before dawn and turning a mangle by mid-morning and darning a stocking by firelight at the very end of a day that never once, from waking to sleeping, offered her a genuine hour that belonged entirely to herself. I think about how completely that labor vanished from any official account of what this household was worth, how thoroughly it was assumed rather than seen, how the entire structure of £90 a year and a respectable terrace house and 3 healthy children rested invisibly on a foundation of expert unpaid, endlessly repeated work that history has mostly declined to write down in any detail at all, which is I think part of why I wanted to write it down tonight carefully, in the particular detail it deserves and so rarely receives. I think as well about how much of what filled Eliza's day has a quiet echo in our own, not the wallpaper or the mercury. Most of that particular danger has thankfully long since been named and removed, but the underlying shape of the thing, the way skilled, constant, essential labor can still in our own century, in our own homes, become so routine that it stops registering as labor at all, simply because no wage is attached to it, and no one outside the house is watching closely enough to call it what it is. The way a household budget, managed well, can still represent a genuine expertise that goes almost entirely unremarked even now, even by people who love and rely on the person managing it. I do not say this to draw too neat a line between Eliza's century and our own. A great deal has changed, and changed for the better. And I would not want you to hear this story as an argument that nothing has moved forward, because a very great deal has. But I think there is something worth carrying forward from tonight beyond the strange facts themselves. A slightly sharper eye, perhaps, for the quiet, competent labor happening around you in your own life. That has never once been given its proper name. And I think finally about the chain of hands that this single ordinary Tuesday belongs to. Eliza's mother, who taught her to lay a fire and manage a budget and lace a corset unassisted, and Eliza's own daughter, Alice, watching from the corner of the kitchen, absorbing all of this the way children absorb everything, without ever being formally taught, simply by watching a competent woman move through demanding day and make it look, to anyone who wasn't paying close attention, effortless. Alice will grow up in the years just past where we are sitting tonight, into a world that is already beginning slowly, unevenly to change. A world where the wallpaper will eventually lose its arsenic, where the teething powders will eventually lose their mercury, where a married woman will eventually gain the legal right to hold property and wages of her own, where domestic labor will very gradually, very incompletely, begin to be seen and named and occasionally even valued in ways her mother could not have imagined possible. None of that change will come easily, or incompletely, or in Eliza's own lifetime in any full sense, but it begins in part exactly here, in 10,000 identical narrow houses like this one, and 10,000 women like Eliza doing the same invisible, skilled, unacknowledged work every single day until enough of that work, and enough of its quiet cost, finally became impossible for the wider world to keep ignoring entirely. There is something I want to say honestly before we close tonight about the word ordinary, because I think it is the word this whole story has secretly been circling from the very beginning. We call a life ordinary when it does not announce itself, when it produces no headline, when the person living it is not required by history to explain or justify herself to anyone. And I think that word ordinary has quietly done an enormous amount of damage over the centuries, because it has allowed an almost unimaginable quantity of skill, of endurance, of quiet daily competence to pass entirely without record, without name, without the simple acknowledgement that skill of this kind deserves. Eliza was not ordinary. She was remarkable in the truest sense of that word, worthy of remark, worthy of being noticed and named and understood in the full particularity of everything her days actually required of her. The world around her simply did not yet know how to say so. I think, in a small way, saying so is part of what tonight has been for. I don't say any of this to make you feel heavy before sleep, my friend. I say it because I think there is something genuinely comforting, not despite its honesty, but because of it, in understanding that the people who came before us were exactly as intelligent, exactly as capable, exactly as full of private thought and quiet dignity as we are, working with what they had inside a world that had not yet caught up to what they deserved. That is not a sad story, in the end, though it holds real sadness inside it. It is a story about how much competence and care can exist inside a single ordinary day, in a single ordinary house, on a single ordinary street that history never bothered to name. The candle in Eliza's room has been out for some time now. Down the narrow stairs in the small cooling kitchen, the last of the range's heat is fading slowly into the night air, and somewhere above in the room she shares with her brother, Alice turns once in her sleep, murmurs something indistinct, and settles again into stillness. Outside, a lamplighter has already passed along the street, and the gas street lamp at the corner burns with its small, steady, hissing light, throwing a warm gold circle onto the wet cobblestones below. The only brightness for 100 yards in either direction, holding back the London dark the way it will hold it back every night faithfully until the lamplighter comes again at dawn to put it out. I want to leave you now the way I always try to leave you. Gently, and with something small and true to carry with you into your own sleep wherever you are, whatever time it happens to be for you tonight. Before I do, I want to ask you something, and I mean this one honestly too. What world do you want to visit next? Tell me in the comments below. I read every single one, truly every one, and the very next video I make will be built entirely from an idea one of you leaves there tonight. Perhaps it's another year, another country, another ordinary house on another ordinary street that deserves, finally, to have its true story told slowly and carefully, the way we've told Eliza's tonight. Leave your idea below, and there's a real chance you'll hear your own name read aloud at the start of the very next episode, as thanks for pointing me somewhere I hadn't yet thought to go. And if tonight's journey was useful to you, if it helped you settle, if it gave your mind somewhere gentle to rest instead of circling on its own, a like and a subscribe genuinely helps more people find their way to an evening like this one, and I would be so grateful for it. Now, my friend, let the story go. Let Eliza's house, and Eliza's hands, and Eliza's whole 150-year-old Tuesday settle back into the quiet dark where we found it. You don't need to hold on to any of it. You don't need to remember the mercury, or the arsenic, or the hair jewelry, or the shillings and the pence. You can simply let it all rest now, the way the house itself is resting, the way the whole street is resting, under a London sky that has already gone fully dark. Sleep now, my friend. Let sleep come the way it always eventually comes, quietly without announcing itself, the way the best and truest things so often do. Rest well. You have nowhere else to be tonight, and nothing else you need to do. Somewhere 150 years away, a gas lamp is still burning at the corner of a narrow street, gold and steady against the dark, keeping its small, faithful watch until morning. Let that be the last thing you carry with you, just a small, steady light in the quiet, and the whole long night ahead of it, and nothing left to do now but rest,